"You should marry my sister," the little girl told the Duke at the garden party. His reaction shocked everyone. Some things happen in life that you cannot plan. You cannot rehearse them. You cannot predict them. They just happen, out of nowhere, in the most ordinary of moments, and they change everything forever. This is one of those stories. It happened on a warm Saturday afternoon, in the summer of 1923, at a garden party in the English countryside, at a grand old estate called Ashford Park in the Surrey Hills. The flowers were in full bloom. The tables were laid with white linen, glasses clinked softly, and laughter drifted through the warm air. A string quartet played beneath an enormous oak tree. Ladies in their summer best moved carefully across the grass, in shoes that were not quite suited for lawns. Gentlemen stood in their good jackets and said the kind of things that people say at these events, things that are polite and warm and do not quite mean anything very much. And right in the middle of all that beauty and noise and careful social performance, a 7-year-old girl with grass stains on her white stockings and plaits that had begun to come undone at the ends walked very deliberately across the lawn, stopped in front of the most powerful man at the party, and said 6 words that no one in that garden would forget for the rest of their lives. "You should marry my sister." That was it. 6 words, spoken by a child who barely reached the man's waist, spoken in a voice that was clear and steady and did not have even a single waver of uncertainty in it, spoken the way a person speaks when they have thought something through very carefully and have simply decided it is time someone said it. The man she had chosen to say it to was Edward Cavendish, the Duke of Windermere. He was 38 years old. He was tall and broad-shouldered and wore his very good gray suit the way some men wear armor, as though it were a thing between himself and the world. He had a face that, at rest, was serious to the point of being austere, and eyes that were sharp and clear and gave away very little. He had not, in the 4 years since his wife died, shown any particular sign of warmth to anyone at any of the parties and dinners and social gatherings that society expected him to attend. He was present, he was correct, he was generous in the right ways, but he was not, in any real sense, reachable. Around him, the moment the girl spoke, 43 people went completely silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A woman halfway through a small sandwich held it in the air and forgot to put it down. Someone behind the rose bushes actually took a quiet step forward to hear better. The string quartet finished their piece and, in the pause before starting the next one, did not start the next one. Then the Duke did something that shocked everyone. He did not laugh. He did not make a politely dismissive sound. He did not look around for the child's parents with an expression of mild amusement. He looked at the little girl standing in front of him with her chin up and her hands clasped behind her back, and something passed across his face. Not quite a smile, not quite surprise, something between the two. And then, very slowly, he crouched down, right there on the lawn, in his expensive suit and his perfectly polished shoes. He crouched until he was at her eye level, and he looked at her the way a person looks at someone they have decided to take seriously, and he said, "Tell me why." The guest list that year included 47 names. Among them were 3 members of Parliament, a retired general who had served in the Boer War and never quite stopped carrying himself as though he were still there, 2 women who were well known in London artistic circles and had been invited because Lady Ashford prided herself on breadth, and a handful of young men and women who were there primarily because their parents were there and who were occupying themselves quietly near the refreshment table. It was, in other words, a perfectly ordinary gathering of exactly the sort of people one expected to find at the Ashford summer party, and it would have been remembered by no one very much had a small girl not walked across the lawn shortly after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Mrs. Alderton, who had brought Clara and Lily and who spent the afternoon in a state of increasing social anxiety about the whole business, said afterward that she had never been more glad or more horrified by anything in her life, in roughly equal measure. She wrote about it to her sister in a letter that her descendants still have. To understand why this mattered, why that moment became the thing it became, you have to understand who these 2 people were before the little girl crossed the lawn. You have to understand what Edward Cavendish had been carrying for 4 years, and what Clara Hargrove had been carrying for 3, and why it was that neither of them could have found each other on their own, by any ordinary means. Edward had not always been the man that Surrey society knew in 1923. There had been a version of him before, a younger version, less careful, more open, someone who had not yet learned that holding yourself apart from things was safer than reaching for them. He had been educated at the usual schools, had come into his title at 26 when his father died, and had found, at 24, something that not everyone finds in a lifetime. He had fallen genuinely in love. Her name was Charlotte. He met her not at a ball or a dinner or any of the arranged settings that were supposed to be where such things happened. He met her at a muddy agricultural fair in the early autumn, when he was there to look at some sheep and she was there because her father bred them, and he had made the mistake of stepping too close to a wooden fence post and getting his boot stuck in the mud beside it and having to stand there, in front of rather a lot of people, trying to pull himself free without looking as foolish as he felt. Charlotte had laughed, not cruelly. It was not a cruel laugh at all, but with the clear, uncomplicated delight of someone who finds a thing genuinely funny and does not have the particular kind of self-consciousness that stops people from showing it. She had helped him free the boot, as well. She had not made a fuss about that either. He had found her again before the end of the afternoon. They had talked for 2 hours in the sheep judging enclosure, of all places, while the animals were assessed and ribbons were awarded, and neither of them paid any attention. They had talked about farming, and about books, and about the very different landscapes they had each grown up in, and about what they thought a life well lived actually looked like, which is a conversation that most people save for very late at night or very old age, but which they had arrived at by the second hour without either of them quite knowing how. He had known by the time he left that afternoon that she was exceptional, not in the way that other people had been described to him as exceptional, not because of her family or her looks or her social positioning, but because of the way her mind worked, and because of the way she talked to him as though he were simply a person and not a title, and because she laughed at real things and took real things seriously, and because he had talked to her for 2 hours and felt none of the particular heaviness that most social occasions left him with. They were married 18 months later. 6 years followed that were, and this is the word he used himself, years afterward, when he finally talked about it, lucky, not perfect. They had arguments, real ones, about real things. They had difficult patches and misunderstandings that took work to untangle. But there was something underneath all of it that held, something that did not waver, and that was the thing that Edward had understood only in retrospect, only after it was gone, was rarer than he had known to be grateful for when he had it. Charlotte fell ill in the spring of 1919. It happened gradually and then fast, the way some illnesses do, as if they are waiting until they have gathered enough strength before they move. She was 33 years old. Edward sat with her through all of it, through the gradual and then the fast, and he held himself together because she was holding herself together and he was not going to be the one who made it harder. He kept that up all the way through the funeral. He kept it up through the reception afterward, and the thank you letters, and the weeks that followed. He broke, finally, alone, in the library, at 2 in the morning 6 days after the funeral. He had been going through the house slowly, in the way that people do when they are not yet ready to clear things but they cannot stop themselves from being in the rooms, and on the window seat in the library he found one of Charlotte's gloves, a small cream-colored glove, the kind ladies wore to afternoon teas. He did not know how it had got there. He held it for a very long time. Then he put it in the top drawer of his desk and went to bed and did not speak of Charlotte again, not to anyone, not in any real way. In the 4 years that followed he became very busy. He ran his estate well. He made good decisions. He was respected and considered capable, and people genuinely liked him, in the careful way that one likes a person who has put a wall up. He went to the dinners and the parties and the shoots and the balls. He was introduced to suitable women regularly, and was always perfectly courteous and always completely absent in the way that matters. He ate well. He slept adequately. He did not feel much of anything that was not habit. He had decided, not in one single moment, but in the slow accumulation of many ordinary ones, that what he had had with Charlotte was a thing that happened once in a life. He did not say this out loud. He did not make a dramatic declaration of it. He simply quietly, stopped expecting anything, and got very good at making that look like contentment. Clara Hargrove's story was a different kind of difficult. Not the sharp, sudden loss that Edward had known, but the slower, quieter kind. The kind that comes from hoping carefully and then watching what you hoped for fail to arrive. She had grown up in a small stone vicarage near the Surrey Hills, the eldest child of a kind and bookish father who believed that education was the most important thing he could give his daughters, and acted on that belief regardless of what it cost. Clara had read everything she could get her hands on from the time she was 5. She had been sent to a good school on a scholarship. She had come back to the village because she loved it, and because her father's health was not strong, and she had taken a position at the village school and found, to her genuine satisfaction, that she was good at it. Teaching was not the thing people assumed it was. It was not, or not only, the standing at the front of a room and delivering information. It was the reading of children, understanding which one was struggling at home and needed gentleness, which one was bored and needed to be stretched, which one was afraid of getting things wrong and needed someone to let them fail safely so they could learn that failing was survivable. Clara was very good at reading children. She was very good at making them feel that they were seen. It was perhaps the most valuable skill she had, and it worked on more than just children. She had been engaged to a man named Frederick when she was 23. He was the sort of man who seemed, at first, to be exactly right, clever and funny, interested in the same things she was, unafraid of her opinions, which a surprising number of men found alarming. They had talked easily from the beginning. She had fallen in love, not suddenly, but steadily, the way she did most things, and she had thought that he had fallen in love with her in the same way. When he left, when he explained, gently and with genuine regret, that the opportunity in London changed what he needed in a wife, that his new life required connections and a certain social competence that a village schoolteacher would find difficult to provide, she had listened to all of it with the careful attention she gave to everything. She had thanked him for his honesty. She had not cried. She cried that night, alone, sitting on the back step in her dressing gown in the dark, looking at the garden. She let herself feel the whole of it, not just the loss of him, but the loss of the future she had been building in her imagination. The specific, ordinary future. A house, shared meals, someone to talk to at the end of the day, someone who chose her. That was the part that hurt most. Not the romance of it, the dailiness of it. She had been looking forward to the dailiness. Then she got up, went inside, washed her face, and went to bed. And on Monday she went to work and taught her students and came home and made supper, and sat with her father while he read, and she read, and the evening passed, and then it was Tuesday, and then Wednesday, and so on, and eventually it was 3 years later, and she was still doing all of those same things, and in most ways she was fine. Not fine in the way people say they are fine when they are not. Actually fine. She liked her work. She loved her father. She had pleasant enough neighbors and a full enough life. She was not unhappy. But there was a particular kind of lonely that lived alongside all of it, quietly and consistently, that she had learned not to examine too closely, because examining it did not help, and she was a practical person. She had stopped imagining the future. She did this deliberately, with the precision of someone who has identified a habit that causes pain and is choosing to stop it. She kept herself very present, very focused on what was in front of her. It worked. The loneliness became manageable, a thing she carried rather than a thing that stopped her. The person who understood all of this without being told, who watched it and said nothing because she was 7 and did not yet have words for it, was Lily. Lily Hargrove was, without question, the most direct human being in the Surrey Hills, and possibly in a considerably larger radius. She had come into the world, their father said, already certain about things. As an infant, she had been clear about what she wanted. As a small child, she had been clear about what she thought. As a 7-year-old, she was clear about what other people should do, and she had absolutely no internal mechanism that suggested this clarity was anyone's problem but theirs. She adored Clara. This was not a gentle or occasional feeling. It was enormous and consistent, and she showed it the way she showed everything, completely. She followed Clara around the house when she was home. She saved things to tell Clara. She was interested in Clara's students and asked about them by name. She brought Clara the best parts of things, the middle of the bread, the biggest apple, the first new flower in the garden each spring, and she watched Clara, not in a worrying way, not in a way that Clara knew about, but in the precise, attentive way that people watch when they love someone and they are not sure that person is all right. She had been watching for the past 2 years, and her conclusion, clear and firm as all of Lily's conclusions, was that Clara was not entirely all right. That Clara was lonely in a way she was trying to hide. That Clara had decided, somewhere in the recent past, that something good was not going to happen for her, and that this decision was wrong. Lily had no patience for incorrect decisions, especially not ones made by people she loved. There had been a moment, about 6 weeks before the garden party, that Lily had not forgotten. She had come downstairs in the night to get a glass of water and had found Clara sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, not doing anything, just sitting. Clara had not heard her come in. She had been completely still, her hands flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular, and her face had an expression that Lily had seen in the looking glass on herself. Sometimes, after something had gone wrong at school, and she did not want to cry in front of anyone. It was the face of someone who was very tired of being brave. Lily had stood in the doorway for a moment and then backed very quietly out and gone back to bed without her water. She lay in the dark afterward and thought about it for a long time. The thought that settled in, with the clarity of things that are simply known rather than worked out, was this. Clara had been being brave for so long that she had forgotten to also be happy, and no one had noticed. Not their father, not the neighbors, not any of the people who thought they knew Clara. Only Lily knew, because only Lily was paying close enough attention. This seemed to her wrong in a way that required fixing. She had been waiting, for some time, for the right person to come along. She kept her eyes open. She paid attention. She was thinking about this on the morning before the garden party, while she was supposed to be doing her spellings. "Lily," said her father from behind his newspaper. "Spellings." "I'm thinking," said Lily. "Think with a pencil," said her father. She picked up the pencil and wrote the words and continued thinking. At the garden party, Lily had held Clara's hand for exactly 4 minutes before letting go. She had not been reckless about it. She had looked first. She had walked around the edges of the gathering for 10 minutes with her eyes wide open. This was the part everyone missed when they told the story later. They assumed she had simply walked straight up to the nearest important-looking man, and she had looked at the Duke of Windermere from a distance for several minutes before she moved. What she saw was a man who was performing, not dishonestly, she could tell the difference, but performing in the way that people do when they are trying to be present at something while being, actually, somewhere else entirely. He was listening to Lord Ashford, and nodding and saying the right things, and all of it was correct, and none of it was real. And in the moment when Lord Ashford was pulled away by someone and the Duke was left standing alone for perhaps 30 seconds, she saw his face do something that it had not done while he was talking. It went still, not peaceful, still in the way of a person who, when there is no one looking, stops pretending to be fine. She recognized this. She saw it sometimes in Clara. She walked across the lawn. She had not planned the exact words. She was not the sort of person who planned exact words. She thought of what was true and said it. She stood in front of him and waited until she was sure she had his attention, and then she said what she knew. He crouched down and said, "Tell me why." So she told him. She told him about the birds and the bread pudding. She told him about how Clara always knew when you were sad. She told him that Clara was the most honest person she had ever met, and the hardest worker, and the person who sat in the garden at night when she thought no one could see her. She told him that her sister had not had anyone choose her on purpose, and that she deserved it more than anyone. She said all of this with the patience and thoroughness of a person who has prepared a case not in words but in knowledge, who knows the subject from the inside out because they have been paying attention for years. The Duke of Windermere listened to every word. He did not hurry her. He did not smile in the slightly condescending way that adults smile at children who are being very earnest. He listened the way that someone listens when they are learning something. When she was finished, the garden was completely quiet. He stayed crouched in front of her for a moment longer. "How long have you been thinking about this?" he asked. Lily considered. 2 years, probably, she said. Something moved across his face. Your sister doesn't know you think about her this much. She would tell me not to, said Lily. She doesn't like fuss. No, he said, as if this fit with something he had already understood. She wouldn't. Then Clara appeared at the edge of the crowd, and the moment, suspended, extraordinary, unlikely, ended. Or rather, it changed into the next thing. Clara had moved through the crowd with the quiet efficiency of panic. She had spotted the stillness, had seen Lily at the center of it, had seen the Duke, and she had arrived in time to hear none of the conversation but in plenty of time to feel all of the weight of its aftermath. She was a composed person. She had learned composure the hard way, through years of needing it. She stood beside Lily and said sorry, properly and directly, not fluttering or babbling, because she was too genuinely mortified for anything other than honesty. And then Lily told her what she had said, and for one long second Clara could not find anything to say at all. The Duke had spoken then, quietly, and told her not to apologize. He had said her sister had made a reasonable argument. He had looked at her in a way that she would think about later, alone in her own kitchen at home, trying to decide what exactly to make of it. He had asked her to walk with him. She had said yes. Later she thought about that, how quickly she had said yes. She was not, generally speaking, a person who said yes quickly to things. She was a person who thought first. She had said yes to this before she had thought anything at all, and she spent a while afterward deciding what that meant. The roses at the far end of the garden were, in fact, extremely good. They had been planted by Lord Ashford's grandmother 80 years before, and they had the particular quality of very old roses, unpretentious, a little wild at the edges, too established to care whether anyone was looking. There were climbers in deep red and pale yellow, and one extraordinary variety that was almost orange, sprawling over a long brick wall with complete disregard for tidiness. Clara stopped in front of them without thinking about it. She had always been the sort of person who stopped for things that were genuinely beautiful. He stopped beside her. He did not say anything about the roses. He just stood and looked at them with her for a moment, which she liked. "My sister," Clara said, because she needed to say something and the silence was becoming companionable in a way she was not entirely prepared for, "is going to be extraordinarily pleased with herself for the next several months." "She has earned it," he said. "She absolutely has not. She was entirely out of order." Both of those things can be true at once. Clara looked at him. He was looking at the roses. There was something in his profile that was less guarded than she had expected. She had braced, on the walk over, for the particular kind of conversation that powerful men have when they are doing you a social favor. This was not that. He was simply here, looking at roses, saying true things. They talked about books first, because it was safe and because they both cared about it, and immediately it became clear that this was not going to be one of those conversations where books were a neutral topic. She had opinions. She was not apologetic about having them. She said, without any particular diplomatic softening, that she had found a certain well-regarded author overwrought in his later period, and much better in his earlier work, and she said why, specifically, with examples. He argued back, not to be polite, genuinely. He made a case for the later work that she had not considered before, and she considered it now, seriously, because that was what you did when someone made a real argument. They talked about what the countryside had been like before the war and what it was like now. She told him about one of her students, a boy of 10 who had lost his father in France and who had gone very quiet the year before, a quality in him that she had been working carefully to reach. He listened to this the way you listen when you understand something from the inside. He laughed, properly, not the social laugh, the real one, which was quieter and came from further back and changed his face completely, made him look younger and less armored, and like the person he might have been before he had reasons to build armor. She noticed this. She filed it away very carefully and tried not to pay too much attention to what she was filing it for. By the time they made their way back toward the party, because they had been gone long enough and propriety had its requirements, and both of them knew it, the afternoon was beginning to soften into evening. The light was lower and golden across the lawns. She found Lily exactly where she had been told to stay, sitting on a garden chair eating a small cake, watching everything with complete serenity. "How was the walk?" Lily asked. "Fine," said Clara, in a tone that she hoped conveyed nothing. Lily looked at her for a moment with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Good," she said, and went back to her cake. He called on her the following week. He arrived at the Hargrove house on a Tuesday afternoon and sat in their small sitting room and drank tea from cups that did not match, and talked with Clara's father for 40 minutes, and then talked with Clara for an hour and a half. Lily sat in the corner of the room doing a drawing and listening to every word. The village, when he came to it for the first time, looked nothing like what he was used to. His estate was beautiful in the grand, maintained way of very old things. The Hargrove house was a vicarage with a garden that had clearly been planted with more enthusiasm than expertise, full of flowers that grew where they liked, and a vegetable patch that was productive but not tidy, and a cat that sat on the wall and regarded visitors with the mild contempt of an animal that had long since decided that humans were mostly irrelevant. The sitting room had books on every surface, not decorative books, actual books, the kind with cracked spines and postmarks and occasionally notes in the margins. The cups did not match. This was not something Edward had encountered very often, and he found, to his mild surprise, that it did not bother him at all. The vicar himself was exactly the kind of man you did not expect to find and then find you have been missing. He had been a country vicar for 35 years, and he had the breadth of someone who has spent those years actually paying attention to the people around him. He had a particular way of asking questions that were not quite questions, more like openings, invitations to think out loud, and Edward found himself saying things he had not said to anyone, not because he had been hiding them but because no one had made a space where they fit. He left that afternoon knowing he would come back, and not only because of Clara, but also because of Clara. She walked him to the gate when he left. The October light was already low, and the garden had that particular late afternoon golden quality that makes ordinary things look significant. She had her hands in the pockets of her cardigan, and she was looking at the gate rather than at him. "Thank you for coming," she said. "My father enjoyed it. He doesn't always find people easy. He didn't find you tiring." "He is not tiring to talk to either," he said. She smiled at this. The real smile, the one that reached her eyes and changed the shape of her face slightly. "Would it be all right," he said carefully, "if I came again?" She looked at him, directly, honestly, deciding something true rather than something strategic. "Yes," she said, "it would be all right." He came back the following week, and the week after, he brought books. Not expensive showpiece editions, but the kind a person brings because they have read them and thought the other person would find them interesting. He brought on one visit a jar of honey from the bees kept on his estate, because Clara had mentioned in passing that she liked honey in her tea. He remembered small things like that. She noticed that he did, and then noticed that she had noticed, and then tried not to make too much of it, and then stopped trying. Lily, for her part, was entirely matter-of-fact about the whole situation. She had decided the Duke was acceptable after their second meeting, when he had answered her question about whether he found it sad to live alone in a very big house, with the kind of direct honesty she herself used. He had said yes, sometimes. He had said it was the kind of sad that is easy to get used to and harder to notice, once you are used to it. Lily had found this answer satisfactory, not because it was a happy answer, but because it was a true one. She showed him the notebook she kept of birds she had identified and drawn in the garden. The drawings were good in the way that drawings by someone who looks very carefully are good, not technically accomplished but accurate. He had listened with complete seriousness and asked questions and looked at the notebook closely, turning the pages carefully, and said that the drawings were very good. Lily had said she knew, and then, after a moment, that the starling was her best one because you had to look at them more carefully than you thought. From that point forward she counted him among the worthwhile people. There had been a conversation, sometime in November, when Lily had asked him very directly what his intentions were. Clara had been in the kitchen at the time, and had heard this through the partly open door, and had closed her eyes. He had said, from the sitting room, with no apparent discomfort at the question, "My intentions are to keep coming to visit, and to see what happens, and to try not to rush something that should not be rushed." Lily had considered this. "That is quite slow," she said. "Yes, but I suppose it is sensible." A pause. Then Lily, "Clara is not very good at being patient with herself." A longer pause. Then him. "No, I had noticed that." Clara had remained in the kitchen for another 5 minutes, until she was confident her face was doing nothing she did not mean it to do. The courtship, neither of them quite called it that, not out loud, was nothing like what Clara had imagined such a thing would be. She had always thought, in a vague way, that falling in love a second time would be like falling in love the first time, but with more caution, the same feelings, hedged more carefully. It was not like that at all. It was slower, and, she thought, more honest. Because they were both people who had already had the experience of something ending, they both understood something that very young people in love tend not to understand, that hope is not the same as certainty, and that choosing to hope anyway, knowing that, is an act of some real courage. Their letters, which began when weather or distance made visits impractical, were the kind she kept, not because they were eloquent, but because of their quality of attention. He asked real questions. He engaged with what she had said in the previous letter. He told her real things about what he was thinking, about the estate, about a decision he was wrestling with, about a conversation he had had with one of his tenants that had stayed with him. He was not performing, not even on paper, and she had met enough people who performed on paper to know the difference. She began to lower the careful wall she had built. Not all at once, she was not that person, not anymore, but brick by brick, in a way she could feel happening, and did not try to stop. They talked about Frederick, not immediately, and not easily, but it came. She told it plainly because that was how she did everything, and he listened without making her feel that she should have told it differently. He did not say it was Frederick's loss, which was the thing most people said because it was comfortable and meaningless. He said that it sounded like it had taught her the wrong thing. She asked what he meant. He said that she seemed to have taken from it the lesson that imagining good things was a way of setting yourself up for pain, and he thought that was the wrong lesson, even if it was the understandable one. "What is the right lesson?" she asked. He thought about it seriously before he answered, which was his way. "That some people are not who you thought," he said. "Not that nothing is worth hoping for." She told him that was easy to say. He said he knew, that he had taken the wrong lesson too, for 4 years, and he was only recently reconsidering. She said what had made him reconsider. He said a small girl at a garden party had told him he looked lonely, and had taken it upon herself to do something about it, and it had been hard to go back to not noticing things after that. They were sitting in the garden when he said this, in the late afternoon light of an October Sunday, with her father inside and Lily at a friend's house, and the cat asleep on the wall. She had her hands folded in her lap, and she was looking at the cat on the wall, and she said, "I used to sit out here at night, after everyone was asleep." "I know," he said. "Lily told me." "She watches me from the window," Clara said. "Not a question." "She watches out for you," he said. "There is a difference." Clara looked at the cat on the wall for a little longer. Then she said quietly, "I was lonely. I got used to it." "You get used to most things eventually, but I was lonely." "Yes," he said. "Just that. No reassurance, no fixing of it, just the acknowledgement that he had heard her, and that it was true, and that truth deserved to simply be received rather than immediately resolved." She thought, sitting there, in the October garden, "I trust this person." It was the truest thing she had felt in 3 years. It was not only the visits and the letters, it was the specific quality of how he paid attention to her, which was different from how anyone else had paid attention to her since Frederick, and also different from how Frederick had, in ways she was only gradually becoming able to articulate. Frederick had paid attention to her ideas. He had liked her mind. What he had not paid attention to was her, the specific person, what she found funny, what tired her, what she was afraid of, what she hoped for, the small particular details that add up to a person. Edward paid attention to the person. When she mentioned in passing that she needed her first cup of tea in complete silence before she was fit for conversation, he asked about this with genuine curiosity. He filed it away. 3 weeks later, when she mentioned she had overslept and not had her quiet morning tea, He simply made the tea and handed it to her, without attempting conversation, and they sat in comfortable silence for 10 minutes while she became herself again. This sounds small. It was not small. She had not been known in the specific and daily sense for a long time. She had been liked and appreciated and relied upon and cared about, but she had not been known. There was a difference, and she had not understood how much she had missed it until it was happening again. She was, carefully and quietly and with eyes fully open, falling in love with him. She knew this. She allowed herself to know it, and then placed it carefully in a part of herself where she could look at it without letting it make her reckless. Her father helped, without trying to. He was simply himself, which was a person who expected good things with the calm confidence of someone who has found, over a long life, that the world is more reliably kind than frightening. He just continued to be someone for whom hope was the obvious and correct response to being alive, and she had grown up watching this, and could not entirely unlearn it, however much she had tried. Lily helped too, in her way. She did not push. She had made her position clear at the garden party, and she appeared to consider that matter settled. She simply continued to be enormously, steadily fond of Clara, the best piece of bread, the biggest apple, the first flower, and in the fact of her presence, which was one of the most reliable and cheerful facts in Clara's life. Clara began very slowly to reach for the future again, not with the old confidence, with something more like courage, the kind that is conscious of what it costs. He proposed on a morning in February when the garden was bare and the frost was still on the gate. He came early, before the household was properly awake, and Clara heard the gate and came to the door in her old coat over her dressing gown, her hair loose, not dressed for anything important. He stood at the gate in his coat and said he was not going to make a speech. He said he was not good at speeches, and she would know, if he made one, that it was not quite him saying it. He said what was true, that he had spent 4 years in a very competent and thorough silence, and that he had not been looking for anything to break it, and that Lily had broken it anyway, which was the most useful interruption that had ever happened to him. He said he did not have a list of reasons why this made sense on paper. He said he had thought about what Lily had said, about being chosen on purpose, about choosing someone because you had looked at them and decided, that one, I want that one, and that he had been choosing her, in his quiet way, since the afternoon he walked with her through the rose garden. I would like to choose you on purpose, he said, out loud, so you know. Clara stood at the door in her dressing gown and thought, clearly and with full presence, there is no version of me that says no to this. Yes, she said. All right, yes. They stood there in the February cold for a moment, the gate still between them, and then she opened the gate and that was that. The winter between the proposal and the April wedding was its own kind of thing. The Cavendish family had expectations, and while Edward dealt with these quietly and firmly, there were still things that required attending to. Dinners and introductions, and the particular scrutiny of people who had opinions about who a Duke of Windermere ought to marry. Clara attended these things. She was not frightened of them. She had been a school teacher for several years, and a school teacher learns early that managing a room full of people who do not necessarily want to cooperate is a skill that translates widely. She was watchful and honest, and she did not pretend to be something she was not, and she found that this, while it did not win everyone, won the people worth winning. One of the Cavendish aunts, an elderly woman of considerable social presence, had taken her aside at a dinner in January and said, without preamble, that she supposed Clara knew she was not what anyone had expected for Edward. Clara looked at her calmly and said that she supposed that was true. The aunt had looked at her for a moment and then said, "He has not looked like that in 4 years." "Like what?" Clara asked. "Like someone who is properly in the room," the aunt said, "not somewhere else." She studied Clara for another moment. "I don't know quite what you did." "I didn't do anything," Clara said. "My 7-year-old sister did it. I was as surprised as anyone." The aunt looked at her for a few more seconds and then, unexpectedly, laughed. A short, genuine sound, the kind that escapes people who are trying not to laugh. "Send her to me sometime," she said. "I have a nephew who needs attending to as well." Clara told Edward this story that evening. He laughed at it in the way he laughed at things that genuinely amused him, and she thought, I will be telling him things for the rest of my life. And this thought, which would once have frightened her with its weight, felt instead like arriving somewhere. The wedding was held in the village church on a Thursday in April, when the apple trees were in blossom, and the air smelled of it. It was not large, as a duke's wedding was expected to be. What they had was the church Clara had grown up in, the vicar who had baptized her, the people from the village who had known her all her life, and the Cavendish family and their immediate circle filling the other side of the aisle with a certain well-bred bewilderment that gradually, over the course of the morning, softened into something that looked very like warmth. Lily walked ahead of Clara up the aisle with the unhurried confidence of someone who belongs exactly where they are. Her sash was tied correctly, because Clara had tied it 3 times that morning until it was right. She carried a small bunch of the first spring flowers from their father's garden, which she had picked herself, and she held them with the dignity of someone carrying something important. Edward stood at the front of the church and watched Clara walk toward him, and the thing that the people nearest him noticed, and which was mentioned in letters and diary entries and was still being spoken of at dinner parties in Surrey several years later, was the expression on his face. Not a polished expression, not the controlled, composed expression of a man performing an important ceremony, a real one, something genuinely felt, unguarded, showing clearly on the face of a man who had spent 4 years being very careful about what showed. He looked, someone wrote in a letter that week, like a person who had come back from somewhere very far away and found, against all their expectations, that home was still there. The years that followed were the ordinary kind, which is to say, they were full. Clara learned the estate the way she learned everything, methodically and with genuine curiosity, asking questions, listening to the answers, caring about the people who worked there in the practical and specific way she had always cared about people. She was not what anyone expected, and this was, in the end, one of the things that made her very good at it. She continued teaching for 2 years after the wedding, because she was not finished and she said so. Edward did not argue with this. He had by then a thorough enough understanding of Clara to know when something was not up for discussion. He visited the school occasionally and sat at the back while she taught, and she found this more useful than she had expected, because he noticed things about which children were struggling, about the way she adapted for different learners, and when they talked about it in the evenings, the conversations were real ones. Their first year at Windermere was its own education, not in any dramatic way. It was the ordinary education of learning to live with a specific person, which is always more detailed and particular than any amount of conversation can prepare you for. She learned that he was not a morning person, and that this was genuine and not performative, and that he was entirely capable of being perfectly pleasant while also being, in some fundamental sense, not quite fully awake until the second cup of coffee. She learned that he worried about his tenants' welfare with the particular intensity of someone who takes responsibility seriously, and that the thing that helped most was not reassurance but simply the chance to say it out loud, which he had apparently been in the habit of not doing. She told him things too, things she had not told anyone, about how tired she sometimes was of being the responsible one, about how she missed her mother in specific small ways that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with absence, about how she was afraid, sometimes, that she was not interesting enough for the scope of this life. He had listened to this last one with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered, and then he had said, simply, that he had not married a duchess. He had married Clara. Everything else was just context. She had held this for a very long time. The house changed, in the small ways that houses change when someone starts actually living in them. Books appeared on tables. Flowers came in from the garden and stayed in rooms past the point when the formal arrangement was done. The mismatched cups from the vicarage appeared in the kitchen, because she liked them and saw no reason not to bring them. A drawing of a bird, the starling, the best one, which Lily had given her as a wedding present, appeared on the windowsill of the library, where Clara could see it. Lily visited often. Edward had made it entirely clear from the beginning that Lily was always welcome, partly because he genuinely liked her, and partly because he understood, without needing it explained, that Clara and Lily were the kind of sisters who needed to be near each other. Lily accepted this invitation with her usual matter-of-fact quality and came on alternate weekends and during school holidays, and sat in the library reading, or in the garden drawing birds, or asking Edward extremely direct questions about the estate management, which he answered seriously because she was asking seriously. It was good. It was genuinely, ordinarily, daily good. Not the grand or exceptional kind, but the real kind that builds itself slowly out of ordinary mornings and shared meals and conversations that go somewhere and conversations that go nowhere in particular, and both being all right. Lily grew up. She remained entirely herself throughout this process, direct and fearless, and occasionally exhausting, and always, always honest. She became a doctor, which surprised no one who had known her, because she had always been the sort of person who walked up to problems and looked at them straight on and decided what to do. She was by all accounts an excellent one. She did not tolerate nonsense. She was very kind. These two things coexisted in her, as they always had. She never quite let Edward forget that she had started everything. She said it with satisfaction, not pride. There was a difference, and Lily understood the difference. She said it the way people say things that are simply true. He received it the same way, which was one of the things Clara liked most about both of them. There is something particular about a life that has been genuinely changed by an unexpected thing. It does not settle back into its old shape. The old shape is gone. What you have instead is a new one, built around the fact of what happened, not replacing the before, not erasing it, but incorporating it the way a tree incorporates a fence post that got too close when it was young. It becomes part of the structure. You carry it differently than you carried anything that you expected. Clara thought about this sometimes. In the years after the garden party, she thought about the version of herself that had driven to Ashford Park that afternoon with no particular expectations, wearing her mother's remade dress, with Lily holding her hand and promising to try to behave. She thought about how entirely ordinary that woman had been. Not lesser, not less worthy of what came next, but simply ordinary in the way that people are ordinary when they have stopped expecting anything extraordinary. She had not known, climbing out of Mrs. Alderton's motor car that afternoon, that she was about to be interrupted. That is the thing about the moments that change things. You never know going in. You cannot brace for them. You cannot prepare the right version of yourself to meet them. You simply have to be the version you already are, which in Clara's case turned out to be more than enough. She thought about this when she looked at her students over the years, the ones who were bracing, already, at 9 and 10 years old, against disappointment, the ones who had learned early that hoping was a way of getting hurt, and who had started building their careful walls while they were still children. She worked very hard on those ones, not to force them open, that was not the way, but to make the space beside them safe enough that they might, eventually, choose to lower the walls themselves. She thought it was probably the most important thing she did in 30 years of teaching, more important than the reading or the arithmetic or the history of England, more important than the correct use of a semicolon, which she also cared about considerably. The walls were the thing. Getting people out from behind them, or at least making them understand that the wall was a choice rather than a necessity, was the work that mattered. She had needed someone to do that for her too. She had needed, as it turned out, a 7-year-old who had not yet learned that walls were the sensible option. Edward, for his part, thought about the garden party differently. He thought about the 30 seconds when Lord Ashford had walked away and left him standing alone, and about what his face had been doing in those 30 seconds. The particular dropping of pretense that happens when you think no one is watching, and about the fact that a child had been watching, and had seen it, and had recognized it for what it was. He thought about how long he had been doing that, dropping the pretense only when he thought no one was watching, carrying the full weight of himself only in private, in the library at 2 in the morning, in the moments between conversations at parties when everyone was looking somewhere else. He had become very good at this, at making the weight invisible, at being a person who appeared to be fine. He had been so good at it for so long that he had almost forgotten the weight was there. He had not forgotten that Charlotte was gone. That was not the weight. The weight was more specific and harder to name than that. It was the accumulated exhaustion of being, entirely alone, a person of particular depth and sensibility, in a life that required mostly surface, of knowing that there were things in him that had no one to speak to, of being, in the fullest sense of the word, unknown. Lily had seen this in 30 seconds. She had looked at a man she had never met, and she had seen, without the interference of any social convention or personal history or complicated feeling, simply a person who was alone and who needed not to be. He had spent a long time, after the garden party, thinking about what it meant that a child could see this, and the dozens of adults who surrounded him regularly could not. He had concluded, eventually, that it was not a failure of those adults. They were perfectly decent people, most of them. It was more that they were looking for different things. They were looking for what was presented, the Duke, the estate, the function. Lily had not been looking for any of that. She had been looking for a person, and so she had found one. He tried, after that, to look for the person more often. It was not natural to him. It was not how he had been taught to navigate the world, but he tried, and he found that it changed things. The conversations he had became more real. The decisions he made felt more grounded. The weight that he had been carrying alone became, in some indefinable way, lighter, as though having been seen had changed its character. "This is," he wrote in a letter to a friend some years after the wedding, "what a good marriage does. Not the large, grand things that people expect, the romantic gestures, the significant moments. Those matter too. But the daily thing, the small, constant thing, is this: you are not unknown. Someone is looking for the person and finding them. Every day, someone is doing that, and the accumulated weight of all those ordinary days is what holds." The village, after the wedding, continued to be itself in the way that English villages do, slowly, with occasional drama and long stretches of very pleasant nothing. Clara's father lived for another 12 years and spent them reading his books and tending his difficult garden, and receiving visits from his daughters, with the patient contentment of a man who has arranged his life around the things he loves and made no compromises about it. He met his grandchildren. He was a very good grandfather, the patient, interested kind who remembered things and asked questions and sat with children in the particular way that makes them feel that their thoughts are taken seriously. Clara's son, who was born in 1926, had his combination of quiet seriousness and unexpected dry humor. Clara's daughter, born in 1928, was, by absolute universal agreement of everyone who knew the family, Lily in miniature, which is to say that she was an immediate and lasting source of great delight and occasional catastrophe. They called her Lily too, in fact. The original Lily, informed of this decision, said it was about time someone was sensible enough to repeat a good thing. The Ashford summer party continued for several years after 1923. Lady Ashford kept her meticulous records, as she always had, and beside the name Clara Cavendish in the 1924 guest list, she wrote simply, "She came back. With the Duke." Very good. It was, by Lady Ashford's terse standards, an effusive endorsement. The story of Lily and the Duke became, over the years, one of those Surrey stories that circulate at dinners and get slightly embellished with each telling. In some versions, Lily was 5. In others, she delivered a speech of 10 minutes' duration. In one particularly enthusiastic account, which Clara found being told at a dinner in 1935, and immediately corrected, the Duke had wept. He had not wept. He had crouched down and listened, which was, she thought, considerably better than weeping, and much more like him. The true version was always better than the embellished ones. The true version had the specific, undecorated quality of things that actually happened: the grass stains on the stockings, the bread pudding mentioned as evidence, the 30 seconds of genuine silence in a garden of 43 people. The true version needed nothing added to it. It was, in all the ways that matter, already exactly right. Clara kept a drawer in her writing desk, for the whole of her life at Windermere, that contained a pressed flower from the rose garden at Ashford Park, given to her by one of the footmen on the day of the 1924 summer party, when she came back as a duchess rather than a companion. The page from Lily's exercise book with the note in the child's handwriting. A letter from her father, written on the occasion of the wedding, and kept because it said exactly what she needed to hear. And, placed carefully at the back, a small cream-colored glove. She had found it in Edward's desk drawer one afternoon, about 6 months after the wedding, when she was looking for a pen. She had understood immediately what it was, and what it had been doing there. She had not moved it. She had found the pen she needed, and gone back to what she was doing. Later that evening, she had told him she had seen it. He had gone very still, and then he had nodded, once. "It can stay," she had said. "It should stay." He had looked at her for a moment, with something in his face that she could not quite name, though she recognized it. It was the same expression he had worn the day he proposed, standing at the frozen gate, saying the true things instead of the polished ones. It was the expression of someone being exactly who they are in front of another person, and knowing they are safe to do it. The glove stayed in his desk for another 3 years, and then one afternoon it was gone, and she did not ask where it had gone, and he did not say, and that was right too. Some things do not need to be spoken about. You simply carry them together, and that is enough. In 1951, Clara wrote in her diary an entry that her daughter later found and kept, and which eventually made its way, along with the diaries themselves, to the Surrey Historical Society. She wrote about the garden party. She had written about it before, in the months and years afterward, but this was the entry of someone looking back from a long distance, with the particular clarity that time gives. She wrote that people sometimes asked how she and Edward came to be together, that they expected a particular kind of story, formal introductions, careful courtship, the appropriate steps in the appropriate order. What they got instead was Lily at a garden party in her best dress with grass stains on her stockings, walking across a lawn to tell a duke he should marry her sister. It was a funny story. Clara had told it at dinners and people laughed, which was correct because it was funny. But what she thought about, when she remembered it, was not the funny part. What she thought about was what Lily understood that she had stopped understanding, that she was sad, and that she did not have to be, and that the reason she stayed that way was that she had stopped believing in good things. Lily had not learned to stop believing yet. Clara wrote that she was glad Lily had not learned that yet. She hoped she never would. Below that entry, tucked into the front of the diary itself, was a piece of paper that had been there since the beginning, written in a child's handwriting, a bit wobbly with effort, on a page torn carefully from a school exercise book. I told him. He listened. It worked. Lily Hargrove, age 7 3/4. There is a particular kind of happiness that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a fanfare or a sudden feeling of completion. It arrives the way good weather arrives after a long gray season, gradually, from a certain direction, and you only notice it is fully here when you look back at where you were before and see the distance you have traveled without realizing you were moving. Clara noticed it in ordinary Tuesday mornings, in the way she moved through the house without thinking about it, in the way a whole day could pass without her once checking, internally, whether she was lonely, because she had not been, and it had become so ordinary not to be, that it was no longer something she counted. She had spent 3 years counting. Then she stopped, and the stopping was so gradual she did not notice when it happened. She noticed it most clearly in small things, in the fact that she talked, really talked, at the end of a day, not the brief reporting of events that passes for conversation in many households, but the real kind, the kind that picks up a thread from the morning and follows it somewhere new by evening. In the fact that she laughed more than she had laughed in the 3 years before the garden party, not because she had been miserable in that time, but because some laughter requires someone to laugh with, and she had been missing that without quite knowing how much. She noticed it in the quality of her work. She had been a good teacher before the wedding, and she knew she had been good, but there was something different in the years that followed, a kind of ease, a kind of groundedness, that she recognized in her best students when they found the thing that made them genuinely interested. You worked better when you were not carrying the full weight of yourself alone. The private burden, once shared, freed something. She had more to give because more was being replenished. She wrote about this in the diary, in various ways, over the years. The attempt was always consistent, to find words for the ordinary texture of a life that had turned out to be, against all the careful expectations she had built in her quieter years, genuinely good. Edward became, in the years of the marriage, a different kind of man. Not transformed beyond recognition, he was still serious, still precise, still occasionally formidable in the way that genuine authority produces and cannot entirely put aside, but he was present in a way he had not been, visible in the fullest sense. His tenants, who saw him most regularly and most honestly, said he was easier. That was the word they used. Easier. Not easier in the sense of less demanding, he was still demanding, about standards and care and the running of the estate. Easier in the sense that he was possible to approach, that you could say a thing to him and have it received, that he was there, properly there, when he walked his land in the mornings, rather than somewhere else behind a polite face. He became a man who was interested in specific people, who remembered things and acted on what he remembered, who asked questions and listened to the answers, who was, in the particular way that his wife was, known, not a performance or a function, but an actual person, recognized and received as such by someone who had chosen to do that work. And the doing of that work had changed him, the way being genuinely known always changes a person, opening something that had been closed and allowing the whole of what was there to finally be used. His estate improved in those years. The people who worked it improved. This should not be treated as a coincidence. A person who is genuinely present, genuinely interested, genuinely reachable, makes things better, not through any grand strategy, but through the daily act of being actually there. It is, Clara thought, one of the most underrated forms of generosity. Showing up, being available, paying attention, doing these ordinary things with your whole self rather than the careful, curated portion you have decided is safe to show. She had learned this from teaching. He had learned it, she suspected, from her. And both of them had had the lesson first demonstrated at a garden party in 1923 by a small girl who had never been taught to do anything less. Some love stories begin with grand gestures and declarations and the exactly right words said at the exactly right moment. Some begin at grand balls with formal introductions and everything in its proper place. And some, the ones that stay real for 50 years, the ones that get written down in diaries and kept in archives and still somehow matter long after everyone involved is gone, begin because a small person with grass stains on her stockings refused to learn the lesson that the world generally tries to teach, which is that you should mind your own business and keep your hopes quiet and not say the thing out loud, because saying things out loud invites disappointment. Lily did not know this lesson yet, or perhaps she knew it and decided it was wrong. It is hard to say, with Lily. Her logic was her own. What she did was walk across a lawn. She said what was true. She looked at a man who was alone and a sister who was lonely, and decided that the distance between them was not a permanent condition, but a temporary one that required a small push. She pushed. Two people who had both, separately and privately, decided that the best of things was behind them, discovered that it was not. They had simply not yet met the person who was going to make the remaining distance worth crossing. The person who made them cross it was 7 years old and 3/4, and she has been, in the long telling of this story, sometimes reduced to a charming detail, the funny bit at the beginning, the anecdote before the real story starts. But she was not a detail, she was the beginning of everything, and she knew it, and she was right. You cannot plan for a moment like that. You cannot arrange for the right small person to walk up to the right large problem and say what needs to be said. You can only hope that somewhere in your life you are lucky enough to have a person who still believes, truly, without the armor that the rest of us eventually wear, that the truth is the truth, and that what you do with the truth is say it. In the Surrey Historical Society, in a small folder in the Cavendish family collection, there are the diaries. There is the Ashford Park guest list with a note in Lady Ashford's handwriting. There is the page torn from an exercise book, kept for 50 years in the front of a diary, kept because Clara never for a moment forgot that it was the beginning. I told him. He listened. It worked. Lily Hargrove, age 7 3/4. That is the whole story. Some things are exactly as simple as a child says they are.